This video will have spoilers for a number of series. Please, keep an eye out for banners like these, and feel free to skip any sections that you would prefer to avoid getting spoiled on. You can also find a full list of spoilers and their timecodes in the video description. Picture this for just a second. You're reading a manga or watching an anime. The stakes are getting higher, the characters are bouncing off each other, and the next big plot development is in sight. Something is about to give. You turn the page, you start the next episode, eager to find out what happens next. And then suddenly, the show introduces a new character. Now, instead of changing the way that the core cast interacts with each other, the story has decided to throw someone new into the mix. Everyone else interacts with each other as normal, but now they have this new person to interact with. A new person who introduces their own subplots and character dynamics, drawing screen time away from the main plot. What you have just witnessed is a plot contrivance that I like to call the Cheryl Blossom effect, where instead of advancing the status quo using the characters already in a narrative, a plot will instead introduce a new character, and using that character will make changes to the status quo. Adding a Cheryl Blossom character has the following effects. Firstly, it can slow down the development of another conflict which might be moving towards resolution. Now it moves more slowly. Additionally, most relationships, aside from that of the Cheryl Blossom character, remain largely the same, while the Cheryl Blossom character will then be able to engage with the characters already in the cast, creating more drama. And then, finally, to the extent that the status quo does change, it changes by creating this new crystalline structure of character networks. That is, we now have a relationship structure which includes all of the existing links from before, as well as this new Cheryl Blossom character. Now, this is a trope that hasn't been discussed very often, and as a result, I don't believe it has a name yet. That's right, friends. This is not an AMV. Tonight, we'll be discussing the Cheryl Blossom effect. So, first things first, why do I call it the Cheryl Blossom effect? I've lifted this title from the Archie comic franchise's character of the same name, and I hope I can explain why. The Archie series debuted in the 1940s, and one of media's most famous love triangles was born with it. Archie, the red-haired male protagonist of the comics, found himself torn between naive heiress Veronica Lodge and hardworking girl next door Betty Cooper. For about 40 years, this love triangle remained in a holding pattern, with Archie drawing closer to Betty or Veronica as needed for each individual story in the comic, then snapping back into non-committal stability so the next story could start from the same status quo. Television sitcoms employ the same sort of episodic comedy, making sure that any changes to the status quo are reversed by the end of any given story, so that a reader can pick up anywhere in the series and understand what's going on. But after nearly 40 years of repetition, this formula started to get stale, and thus, in 1982, Cheryl Blossom graced the pages of Betty and Veronica Volume 320. How do you create a character to rival the original all-American duo of Betty and Veronica? Well, apparently, you make her richer than Veronica, and give her no inhibitions whatsoever. Cheryl is impossible to ignore, because she always has to be the center of attention. This means that while Betty and Veronica are each other's worst enemies when the story centers around them alone, they find a common enemy in Cheryl, which gives the two friends a reason to team up. So in my intro, I described some of the ways that a Cheryl Blossom-type character impacts the story that she's in, but I didn't drill down on what really makes a character a Cheryl Blossom. This begs the question, what is the difference between a Cheryl Blossom and just a general character introduction? I'm going to highlight 4 criteria here, 2 of which are optional. 1. The character is introduced after the majority of the cast. 2. The character is a rival to one or more of the existing main characters, or otherwise exists to upstage one or more existing characters. 3. Optional. Until shortly before the character's introduction, the story does not foreshadow the introduction of this character. 4. Optional. The character fits into another character's backstory, or otherwise has close connections to a main character. To fit Cheryl Blossom herself into these criteria, 3 out of the 4 apply. Cheryl Blossom is introduced 40 years after Betty, Veronica, or Archie, meaning that she passes Criterion 1 with flying colors. Cheryl is also a rival to both Betty and Veronica, although her role as an heiress often pits her against Veronica specifically. Criterion 2 passes as well. Now, due to the Archie series' identity as an episodic comedy, Cheryl is also not foreshadowed, nor really would we expect her to be. This is actually why comedy series feature the Cheryl Blossom effect frequently. In fact, comedy series introducing Cheryl Blossoms into their stories is so common that I'll be limiting the examples that I list from episodic comedy series. Just know that this is only the tip of the iceberg, and that a new flashy character is a pretty common way to wring new comedy out of an old cast. Side note, as I was researching, I actually found out that Cheryl Blossom might have been too good at her job of shaking up the series, because she was actually removed from the Archie comics 2 years after her introduction. Probably because she was too sexual for Archie's squeaky clean brand. However, she was returned in 1994, and has been with us ever since. One more thing I'd like to highlight about the Cheryl Blossom effect is that characters who are introduced to a story in this way aren't necessarily bad or lazy characters. In fact, many of them are my favorite characters in their respective franchises. I chose Cheryl as the poster child for this phenomenon because of the rivals for Archie Andrews' affections. I think Cheryl is my favorite. She's over the top in a way that elevates the scenes that she's in, and she's just very fun to watch. I also want to distinguish the Cheryl Blossom trope from the Mary Sue. While both are similar in the sense that they get special treatment from the author, Mary Sues usually act as an author insert, or as audience inserts, and we're supposed to root for them. Cheryl Blossoms, meanwhile, are sometimes sympathetic characters, but since they're often rivals to our likable protagonists, that special treatment usually isn't a literary shortcut intended to make us like or root for these characters. Instead, it's a shortcut intended to establish the new character as a credible rival, or just in general, to justify how this character shakes up the established dynamic. And of course, you also get some special edge cases, such as the anime Saga of Tanya the Evil, which features a Cheryl Blossom character named Mary Sue. Lieutenant Sue in Yojo Senki, or Saga of Tanya the Evil, is a late-season addition to the cast of this historical fantasy anime, taking place in an alternate universe in which the European imperial powers of the early 1900s fight each other with both magic and conventional weapons. Sue meets qualifications 1, 2, and 4 on our list. She's a late addition, she becomes Tanya's most deadly rival, and she's connected to Tanya in that she's sent to kill her by the same god who reincarnated Tanya into this setting in the first place. She does not, however, qualify for optional qualification number 3, as her father is well established in the plot early on and is killed by Tanya, inspiring her to join the United States military to get revenge. Misa Amane. Perhaps one of the most famous examples of the Cheryl Blossom effect, there's a reason I used clips from Death Note to illustrate the Cheryl Blossom effect at the start of the video. While the conflict between Light and L is precise and logical, Misa enters without warning in episode 11, and gravely threatens Light's position as Kira by using the same powers as him with less concern for the consequences, increasing the chances that she would be caught and that Light, in turn, would be discovered. For that matter, she ends up forming a romantic relationship with Light. I could very easily have called this the Misa Amane effect, but Misa fits a lot of other tropes, so that description would easily get confusing. Still, she's an excellent Cheryl Blossom character who pushes back the resolution of Death Note's main plot, replaces the show's web of character relationships with a new structure that now includes her, and arguably becomes the flashiest character in an otherwise grounded anime. Rollo Lamperouge. It's hard to seamlessly slip a new character into an anime without confusing people, so Studio Sunrise didn't even try. The jarring addition of Rollo in the first episode of Season 2 is designed to make every audience member ask, wait, since when did Lelouch have a little brother? Soon, the truth is revealed. Rollo is an assassin who has implanted memories in Lelouch's head so that he can get close to the young mastermind. Even though he's decided he actually loves Lelouch as a brother, however, he continues to cause problems for Lelouch with his possessive and violent tendencies, notably killing off Shirley and placing himself on Lelouch's revenge list. Ruka Suirenji, Hayate the Combat Butler. Ruka is a pop idol who was introduced 25 volumes into the Hayate manga, making her anime appearance after the series was revived in 2011. Ruka is yet another romantic rival for Hayate's affections, and she was saddled by her parents with incredible debt, causing her to overwork herself to unhealthy degrees. Sound familiar? If so, that might be because that's also Hayate's backstory. Her similarities to Hayate make her a rival especially to Nagi, the story's lead heroine, and Hayate's original benefactor. Yuri Breyer and Agent Nightfall from Spy Family. I'm listing these both together because they fill the same role in the series. Yuri is foreshadowed, Yor calls him on the phone in the episode that she's introduced, so while he appears abruptly as an obstacle to her marriage to Lloyd, he does not meet optional qualification 3. However, he is a character from Yor's backstory, so he meets the 4th optional qualification. Nightfall, however, meets all 4 qualifications. She's a later addition to the cast, rival to Yor for Lloyd's affections, has a relatively unforeshadowed character reveal, and is a spy from Lloyd's agency. The final characters I'll be highlighting are another duo, and they really exist on the borderline between true Cheryl Blossoms who work perfectly in their plot, and false positives who may not be Cheryl Blossoms at all. These characters are Zelos and Philia from The Slayers, a D&D-inspired comedy-action anime from the mid-1990s. Zelos is introduced without warning at the beginning of Season 2, and as a self-proclaimed mysterious priest, feels that his role is to antagonize the party in general, and Zelgadis in particular. Zelos is especially tied to Lena as well, because one of her most powerful spells invokes his boss's boss. Philia is similarly a late addition introduced at the beginning of Season 3, but while she isn't personally foreshadowed, the bloody war between the dragons and the Mazoku has already been well established by the time she shows up. While Zelos exists to antagonize the original adventuring party from Season 1, Philia mostly exists in the party's dynamic to put pressure on Zelos. Because, well, she's a dragon, and he's a Mazoku. And while Zelos has pretty much gotten over the slaughter of Philia's people, Philia really hasn't. But with these two characters, we start to reach the limits of the Cheryl Blossom definition. Can a character who's essential to the main plot still be a Cheryl Blossom? For that matter, can villains or anti-heroes be Cheryl Blossoms, or are they something else entirely? With these questions, I would like to move our discussion into a series of characters that I think are Cheryl Blossom adjacent, but who I think are false positives. The first false positive, ironically enough, is Cheryl Blossom, from the Riverdale TV series. This version of Cheryl gets introduced in episode 1, so she fails on our first qualification. She does still upstage people, though. While the Cheryl Blossom trope we're laying out here is intrinsically tied to how and when the character is introduced into a plot, it's still nice to see a universe where Cheryl was with us from the start. And gets magical powers, apparently. Asuka Langley from Evangelion. Asuka meets the criteria for the Cheryl Blossom effect. She's introduced after the first arc, she's a rival to both Shinji and Rei in different ways, and she isn't foreshadowed before her introduction. However, I hesitate to describe her as a Cheryl Blossom for the following reasons. Like with Zelos and Philia, I hesitate to describe a character as a Cheryl Blossom when the story simply couldn't have continued without them. Evangelion owes a lot of its identity to Asuka, and Asuka arguably drives the emotional stakes of Evangelion and grapples with its themes of finding purpose, belonging, and self-worth just as much as Shinji does. Now, Mari from the Rebuilds might be a true Cheryl Blossom, but as I hope I've made clear by now, the Cheryl Blossom effect is not necessarily a bad thing, especially when your show has a hard cap at 4 movies like the Evangelion Rebuilds did. If one of the biggest weaknesses of the Cheryl Blossom trope is that introducing these characters can feel like padding, then Rebuild of Evangelion may have sidestepped that risk entirely. Another Gainax mainstay, Nia Teplin is a late addition to the cast who is not hinted at beforehand and forms a loving relationship with our protagonist Simone. But your intuition probably rejects the idea that Nia is a Cheryl Blossom as much as mine does. First, she doesn't fit the profile. And while her presence comes to dominate the cast, it's hard to see her as a rival or a deliberate competitor for the spotlight. Gurren Lagann also introduces Nia to fill the gap left in Kamina's absence. This means that the protagonist's dynamic would have changed even without her introduction, so adding her to the party feels less like a sudden shakeup and more like part of the recovery process from the last shakeup. And also, Nia is central to the second core of the anime, so much so that it could not possibly be the same without her. So due to that hazy, absolutely necessary for the plot consideration, I'll be labeling her a false positive. And for our final false positive, Gilgamesh, Fate Stay Night. The structure of Fate Stay Night's Holy Grail War locks in a reliable cast of servants and masters, which makes Gilgamesh's appearance in the original Deen anime all the more shocking. He and Saber have a history, which naturally makes him an obstacle not only to the legitimate participants in the Holy Grail War generally, but to Shiro in particular. There's a reason, however, that most Cheryl Blossoms are merely rivals and not outright villains, and that's because mid-series villain reveals are actually pretty common. Gilgamesh's reveal may be striking, but he exists within the context of another trope, the late story final boss reveal. So Gilgamesh might be a false positive as a Cheryl Blossom, but he's a staple of the series for a good reason, and his effective villainy is why he gets brought back as a villain in Fate Zero and as a hero in Fate Grand Order. So, what is the Cheryl Blossom effect? The The Cheryl Blossom effect is a phenomenon where a character is introduced later in the story than the rest of the main cast, and upstages one or more existing characters. At its worst, adding a Cheryl Blossom can be a cheap way to pad out the runtime, delay resolution of conflicts, and create a new static network of character interactions to replace the old one instead of advancing the characters' relationships. But at their best, Cheryl Blossoms can force the existing characters out of their comfort zones, introduce interesting new conflicts, and give us new, over-the-top characters to love. The best time for Cheryl Blossom introductions is just after an arc has ended, or in a story that's guaranteed not to go on for too long. And of course, Cheryl Blossom characters who undergo enough development of their own, or become truly necessary to the plot, can transcend the Cheryl Blossom category entirely. But those are just my thoughts, and I would love to hear yours. Are there some characters that you think maybe I was too hasty in labeling Cheryl Blossoms? Maybe one or two of the characters that I said were false positives seem more like Cheryl Blossoms to you. Heck, maybe there is some trope that I have overlooked which describes what I'm talking about here. Or for that matter, maybe there's a character that you think fits the Cheryl Blossom effect better than Cheryl Blossom herself. If so, I'd love to hear about it in the comments, but until then, good night, friends.